Why is it that the apostle could specifically utilize homosexuality in Romans chapter 1 as an illustration? What was he illustrating? What was the issue? Well, let's take a look at it. Romans chapter 1. You may recall about a year ago, we started going through a presentation that Dr. Brownson had made. We never finished it. We got to the point where we explained his fundamental error in trying to cram Paul's teaching into a Stoic philosophical concept rather than the Old Testament, which is clearly its background. And we never finished it up because it was sort of like, well, we got to the heart of the matter. Other things came up. We never finished it. One of the many things I've done like that, I'm afraid. But it has been a little while since we walked through Romans chapter 1. If you have my book, The God Who Justifies, I spent quite some time on Romans 1 as a background and foundation for dealing with Romans 2 and Romans 3, which I think is important in dealing with justification as a whole. But after the introduction of the fact that sin impacts man's self-knowledge, it impacts all of man, so that even his reasoning, even his thinking is impacted by being separated from, out of fellowship with, the source of his life, the source of his meaning. For example, verse 21, for even though they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks, but they became futile in their speculations, and their foolish heart was darkened. And so speculations, the very term, dialogus mois, and their hearts becoming asunetos, without understanding. That's the central core of man's being. That's as intimate as it gets. Sin is not just external to us. It's not just what goes on around us. It is very, very internal. It has impacted us, and I really think part of the defenselessness of many churches today to the influx of this identity politics, leftist worldview leaning attack is because many of those churches have not had a true biblical anthropology. If you have a true biblical theology, doctrine of God, then it's going to give you a lot better position to come up with a true biblical anthropology, a doctrine of man, and a recognition of the impact of sin, a hamartiology, a study of sin and the impact upon man. And the result is the darkening of the reasoning, the resulting in foolishness, futility, emptiness in man's thoughts. And man, all you got to do is go on social media and say almost anything, and you'll get to see a good example of that. I mean, This is sort of related. Did you see that guy who was fired from CrossFit because, as a minister, he had said online that it is sinful? And the way he put it was, he didn't say it was sinful to celebrate gay pride. The point was that it's sinful to be prideful. It happened to be in reference to a gay pride event, and everybody's just assumed that. But he actually said it was sinful to be pride. Can you imagine anyone only 50 years ago getting fired for saying that it's sinful to be prideful, to celebrate pride? Can you imagine that? How far we have fallen as a society. But man, CrossFit got rid of him quick. You can't have Christians working in your companies. Not if you want to be cutting edge, even though all you're doing is doing workout stuff and stuff like that. But anyway, their foolish hearts have been darkened. And as a result, there is this exchange of the glory of the incorruptible God for an image in the form of corruptible man, of birds, four-foot animals, and crawling creatures. In other words, man is a worshiping creature. And that impulse to worship is going to be expressed, whether it is, if it's not directed toward the one true God, then it's going to be directed at the creation. And this is what takes place. Then he gives an illustration of this, and people go, the standard thing you're going to hear on the interwebs these days is, this doesn't have anything to do with loving, monogamous, homosexual relationships or with faithful homosexuals. This is only about idolatrous homosexuals. Well, that's not how anyone who has the background of the Old Testament in mind, as you have to for interpreting Paul on anything else. Anybody who tries to separate that out from Paul is obviously trying to avoid an element of his teaching that they don't like. But I'm gonna have to keep that. Tweet that I just saw up there. I will definitely be responding to Joseph the Berean. I'll be responding to you in just a little while. Let Joseph the Berean on Twitter know that I'm going to read his tweet on the dividing line, and I'm going to demonstrate that he is no Berean. He has no clue what being a Berean is. So let Joseph know. Somebody pop onto Twitter and let Joseph the Berean know that he might want to tune in, because what he said demonstrates he has no clue what the Bereans actually did. But we'll get to that. So back to the issue here. So why would Paul, having just said what he said, use homosexuality as an illustration here? Well, I think it's very important to recognize that the reason that he does this is that there is something about homosexuality that illustrates the point that he's making in this section. And the point that he's been making is the core of man's being is impacted by sin. It's right there. What makes man man is impacted by sin. So we read, therefore, God, and paradiken is from paradidomi. That's the same term that's used of the betrayal of Jesus. It's to give over. But here it's God gave them over in the desires of their hearts unto uncleanness or impurity. That is the dishonoring of their bodies amongst themselves. So there is and the soma is pretty much definitely the issue of the physical body. So there is a dishonoring of that in which has been made in the image of God. That the somata. For they exchanged, and alexen, metalaxen, that's just a strengthened form of the exchange motif that's here in Romans 1. For they exchanged the truth of God for the lie, or in the lie, and worshipped and served the creature or the creation rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. So there is a exchange that has gone on, an exchanging of the truth of God for the lie. This is necessary if you are not in right relationship to God. You don't want the truth of God about your own rebellion. You don't want the truth of God regarding your coming judgment, and so you exchange it for something else. Now, for this reason, diatuta, God gave them over, same paradidomi, unto pathe atamias. Anyone remember when I asked Barry Lynn, those 17 years ago, about what pathe atamias meant, and because he was trying to say there's two different sin lists, and some are just expected things, and and it just made absolutely no sense. So it's like, so degrading passions, is that a sin or not a sin? Yeah, he had obviously he had gotten way too used to being on liberal media and being tossed, or taking on Christians who would never challenge him. That's why by the end of that debate, he was not a happy camper. And it wasn't just at the end of the debate either, as the resulting lawsuit later on indicated. Anyway, for this reason, God gave them over to degrading passions of dishonor. Pathe atamias. High Tegar. I think High Tegar, Thelai, they're women. I think the best way to, for even their women, I think there is there's actually, I think, an honoring of women in what is said here. You know why? Because the idea is that it is shocking and amazing that the woman with her maternal instinct, the woman with her focus upon family and children and nurture and all the things that God has equipped her to be, that even women could be impacted at the very center point of their being, so as to twist and turn. The whole thing in Romans 1 is about the creator-creation relationship. So as to twist and turn at that very issue, that very element. And so for even their women exchange, and there's your metalaxon again, that this is the term that's either in the strengthened form here or the less strengthened form. It's being used throughout Romans 1, the exchange. So even their women exchanged the phusikein, the natural kresin function, for that which is paraphusin. Now, I'm not going to go back over this, but the only sensical, consistently exegetical way, if you were talking about anything else with Paul, you'd go to the Old Testament here. You'd go to the parameters that are laid out by the Tanakh. This is the natural. He's already in Romans 1 been paralleling creation narrative language anyways. So the natural function for that which is unnatural. And the honest way of reading this is the only reference in the Bible to lesbianism. Exchanging a natural function for that which is unnatural. That's just all there is to it. So the point is that this exchange is not just external, it's not just minor, it is definitional. Once the creator-creation relationship gets broken and twisted, it touches all the way to the very core identity of even the woman with her beautiful, created, God-given ability to nurture life. She stops nurturing life. And if you didn't see that last week in Ireland, you weren't looking. You weren't looking. Every time as Western culture just flies off the cliff towards self-destruction and the culture of death is victorious, when you see these women rejoicing in being granted the ability to murder their offspring, there it is. There's Romans 1. There's Romans 1. So that which is unnatural. And in the same way, so the parallel holds in the same way, likewise also, the men abandoning the natural function of the woman. I mean, that since it's homoios here, and natural function of woman is obvious. We know exactly what that is. We're talking about sexual relationships here. No question about it. So that reads back into the preceding, if anyone's trying to get verse 26 to mean something else. The man abandoned the natural function of the woman, and this is not about pederasty. This is not about anything like that. Burned in their desire toward one another. This is mutual homosexual desire. It's the only way you can read it. Men with men committing indecent acts and receiving in their own persons the due penalty of their error. The point of the illustration is not to condemn homosexuality, because in Paul's mind, that was already given. That was already given. His high view of the law, the moral and ethical content of the law, his high view of the law made that a given. You're not throwing out the moral content of the law. The same apostle who in 1 Corinthians chapter 5 holds the Corinthians accountable for what the holiness code said about incest clearly held the same views in regards to homosexuality, which then comes out in 1 Corinthians 6 and 1 Timothy 1. But he's not introducing that here, because that isn't even a question. It's not necessary for him to be repeating the Old Testament law. That's the moral content is a given. Sorry to some of my friends who think that the New Testament has to repeat everything from the Old Testament for it to be valid anymore. That's not the case. He's not introducing something new here. He's using it as an illustration. Yes, God has already said, this is wrong. This is not how I created you. But what it's illustrating in his argument is how deeply to the very core of the human being sin can go. Now, some people looking at this text say, well, then there's no reason to evangelize homosexuals because it says God has given them over. But you have to let Paul speak for Paul. 1 Corinthians chapter 6. He mentions homosexuality and says, such were some of you, but you were cleansed. You were justified. Salvation came to those individuals, and they were cleansed. It says, such were some of you, not such are some of you. And that brings us to why I've been talking about all this for nearly half an hour now. Specifically, is homosexuality in any way different than any other sin? It seems that people are trying to promote the idea that it's just the same as any other sexual sin. So if a husband or a wife falls into immorality in a marriage, there is infidelity that takes place. Sexual sin outside of marriage. It's just the same as if homosexuality takes place. And the desire for sex between a man and a woman is directly parallel to the desire for sex between two men or two women. There's no difference. As long as it's in marriage, but it can't be in marriage for same-sex couples within the Christian ethic. And so you have to be chaste and you have to be celibate. But here's the question. Is the desire no different? It seems that many people are functioning on the basis that the desire, there's no difference in the desire. And this is where I have to go, there is a difference in the desire. The desire of a man to have sexual intercourse with a woman is a natural desire. It becomes inordinate, excessive, when that desire is outside of marriage. But it remains a natural, if overdriven or excessive desire. But it's still a natural desire. There is a fundamental difference between having a natural attraction to a beautiful woman and having a natural attraction to a horse. There's a fundamental difference. And I would hope we're not quite to the point yet where someone would argue that there is no difference there. That it would be, if someone happens to have that kind of desire, that, as long as they don't act on it, then it's not sinful. No, that is, the Roman Church in its magisterial documents has referred to homosexuality as a disordered desire because it's confusion. Tevel is the Hebrew term from the Old Testament. It's confusion. It's confusion of categories. It's confusion of the created categories of order, which is we find right here, the natural use, because there's a creator who defines these things. And so the desire, you all saw, in the social media last week, I think it was last week, well, the past few weeks, it's been a little bit hard to follow. In the social media of the past few weeks, there was a story about this guy, I think in Virginia or somewhere back east or south or something, openly promoting pedophilia, abuse of women, just a complete sexual pervert. If you can even use that term anymore. I mean, that term used to have meaning. I'm not sure that it does anymore in our society. But there was outrage. I don't know how long there will logically be able to be any outrage towards something like that. We recognize that it is absolutely disordered. It is inappropriate. It is wrong to have a desire like that man has expressed. So that's not parallel. There is a fundamental violation of categories represented. The desire for a man, for a woman, is a natural desire, but it can become excessive. But it's still a natural desire. Children, animals, and the same sex involves a corruption of the categories of the natural desire. It is disordered. And therefore, when you talk with someone who is same-sex attracted, it seems to me that there is a massive, huge category distinction between counseling them by saying, well, by saying what the Pope said to that guy a couple weeks ago, God made you like that. Okay, that's way out there. We can throw the Pope and his sexual ethics out the window. But there is a difference between saying your same-sex attraction needs to be controlled, but you can identify yourself by it and say that that is how God has made you, as long as you don't act upon it. And saying to someone it's a disordered desire and the desire itself is displeasing before God. Now, please don't tell me, as I've been seeing a lot in social media, please don't tell me that you can limit the area of sin solely to that of activity and not of desire. Because covetousness, thou shalt not covet. Covetousness is an attitude. It's solely in the heart. It's solely in the heart. Greed is solely in the heart. So God does address that and identify as sin attitudes in the heart. How is it any different? To say, there is a sense of greediness in a person who wants to commit adultery, to go beyond what God has provided in his wife or his husband. But that's not a twisted desire in the way that homosexuality is, or bestiality would be, or pedophilia would be, or any of these things that involve tevel, the fundamental confusion of the categories of creation itself. Now, I've seen arguments from both sides on this conference, and I've seen some of the workshops just make me go, whoa, wait. I seriously reject the idea of a Christian finding their identity in a disordered, sinful desire for same-sex encounter. Along these lines, I listened to about a 2-year-old interview that Eric Metaxas did with a fellow by the name of Dr. Nate Collins. Dr. Collins is a graduate of Southern Seminary. And as far as I've seen indication, he's still at least teaching for them in online classes for Southern Seminary. He is a married gay man by his own description in a mixed orientation marriage. So that he's married to a woman, he has children by her, they are his children through natural sexual intercourse. But he said right in the interview, I cannot imagine having the feelings for any other woman than for my wife, but I can imagine having them for men. So he calls himself a gay man. And he defines it in the context of beauty, that in which he finds beauty. Now, of course, we're talking about sexuality here. And it would be nice if you can create all these divisions and distinctions, but we all know those divisions and distinctions become very, very blurred in human experience and in human fallenness. But what has to be, as far as I can see, what has to be said to have any kind of meaningful understanding of a biblical hamartiology, biblical doctrine of sin, is that the desire for any of that kind of behavior, orientation that fundamentally redefines the categories of what God says through creation we are to experience is sinful and should never be, for a Christian, that by which we identify ourselves.